Hey, this is Brooks with Character Design Forge. I wanted to show you my process for integrating illustrated elements into photographs on 2 illustrations that I've done. They're part of a series that I'm doing this month. Before we get to the editing process, of course, I went out and took all the photos in this series for this first one here. I set up a tripod, shot the scene in focus, and then another shot with this ring in focus. And then I balanced the photos in Lightroom and then brought them into Photoshop, where I masked the center of the lens out. And because I'm bringing this into Procreate on the iPad afterward, I created a layer specifically for that mask, just because of the way that selection works in Procreate. So if you were illustrating this in Photoshop at this point, though, you'd be ready. I added an extra cartoony bit of reflection on the lens as well and exported each layer to be brought into Procreate separately. So first off, I'm sketching out my creatures, just trying to make them look like they belong in the picture. And I'm trying to make it look like there are far more of them if you were to move the lens around, like it would be densely populated with them. And briefly here, I had made some lines that I usually don't, but it's just to account for the composition. Sometimes it's called leading lines, and it's just figuring out what kind of flow there is to all the elements within the creatures and figuring out how they can best support that so that it looks well composed. And as much as you want them to be random and haphazardly placed, this can help things look nicer. I added a translucent white layer just so I can see my sketch better, and I toned down the expression of the creature that's right there in the lens. Even though it was cute, I thought it might not be wild enough and come across as too much, so I reduced it down to that sort of blank stare that he gives you now. Next, I'm blocking in the flat colors behind the sketch, and so maybe I can talk about my approach to this. My idea was never to make the added creatures photorealistic. And I always wanted it to look like cartoonish characters that were inhabiting the real world. So there's a lot more to that, though, than just pasting a drawing on top of a picture. So the main thing that I can compare this to is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which uses cartoon characters, but it accounts for light, weight, physicality, and perspective. So you'll see the recording just kind of jumps ahead there, and that's not my doing, that's just kind of how this recording is. It loses a few steps. And it does that in the next illustration too. That's just something with the recording from Procreate. Making the characters look like they belong in the photo begins with the moment you're holding the camera, and you should be able to think ahead roughly and compose the image so that it's possible to add an element or a character or creature. And if there's a person, make it plausible that they are interacting with the character or the character could be interacting with them. Now during the sketch, it's incredibly important that you account for perspective. That your character is occupying the space realistically. And it might be helpful for you to draw out a grid or some perspective lines on your photo, like little platforms that they can stand on, basically, and account for that. Perspective, lighting, and focus, those are the 3 things that you have to think about as you're trying to successfully integrate these elements. So lighting involves using the same light source and direction of light as in the photo. So in this case, I have the sunlight coming through the trees, and so I'm adding shadow onto the other side. And I also add some rim lighting as well, as there's lots of bouncing and ambient light in this picture. And it helps convey the roundness of the creatures, and it keeps them from being too flat. As we start the next one here, focus was that 3rd thing that I was talking about, and you immediately see me implementing some help with that. So with cameras and lenses, you have focal lengths and depth of field, which basically means that the camera is going to focus on one depth or measurement away from the camera. And in the image, that will be in focus, but then things that are closer and further away won't be in focus, and they might be a little bit more blurry. So I made those lines on this log as a way to show sort of the degrees of blur and focus in the image. So the foreground is out of focus, the intermediate area there is in focus, and then the further back you go, the more out of focus it gets. So making sure that the characters match the focus of the area they're in is really important too. I spent a lot of time on a little character who you actually don't end up seeing too well, and to add him, I masked out a few of the pieces of moss that he'd end up being behind. And in Procreate, that means filling the positive space on one layer and selecting it, and then using that selection on the actual drawing layer. I added some out of focus characters in the back there, and again, that sketch of the floating tadpole-looking dragon character is just going to pop into existence here, and I wish I knew why Procreate jumped like that in the time-lapse. I end up illustrating him monochromatically like that, and I add some noisy texture, and then I duplicate him over top, shift the hue to a different color, and then I use a soft eraser to get rid of the entire back half of him, like that, so that it looks like a gradient color shift over its body. After I add some little floating specks of light, which just adds to this underwater murkiness feel that I was going for, I add another character really close up in the foreground just for some added complexity. The last thing that's just something subtle, usually photographs that are taken digitally especially, I'm not so sure on old film cameras if this was true, but if you zoom in really close you'll have some noise. I guess in older cameras it was kind of the grain. So what I like to do is add a layer of monochromatic noise, lower the opacity, and then set it to overlay blending mode. So that's those 2 illustrations. I'm doing a few more this month. Some of them are already up. You can see them over on Instagram. Follow me there at BagelDenizen. I hope this video was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions about this process. It's something that I've just been figuring out in the last few months, and I'll kind of tweak things as I go, but I'm pretty happy with the final results of things so far. That's it for me today. I'm making new videos every week at Character Design Forge. Subscribing on YouTube lets you know when new videos are made available. We have another show called Character Select, where we make up like a ridiculous game character on the spot, including their backstory, their gameplay mechanics. It's very silly. There's a new episode coming tomorrow, and we kick it off with a pretty cool announcement, which is something I think a lot of people were waiting for in regards to the show. I don't mention it often, but I thought I'd say it again. If you're interested in getting personalized help, mentoring, critique, just help with your own work and your art goals, I offer one-on-one sessions that are, I guess there's no real better word for it than potent. They're super effective, basically. Just having someone look at your stuff, give qualified feedback, course correct the work, course correct any mindset or habit issues you may have. And I think this is the fastest way to improve as an artist. So head over to brookeseggleston.com/one-on-one to find out more about that and to contact me. Thank you for watching, and have fun creating.